All right. You guys hear me okay? Dan, Michael?
Yeah.
Very good. Got a good number of participants today. Thanks everyone for tuning in for our first OWASP San Antonio remote meeting. It's definitely been an interesting year. We are looking to close it out strong for our chapter here. So look out for more meetups in the next couple of months, and we should have some interesting stuff planned. OWASP-wise, in case you're not aware, there is a global AppSec conference going on right now. It's all virtual. It started yesterday and continues throughout the month of October. I'll put a link into the chat here once we get started, so you can check that out. I definitely recommend it. There's a lot of good virtual talks there. Good opportunity to sync up on the AppSec industry and what OWASP has going on with all their projects. So definitely encourage you to take a look at that. For our meeting today, we've got Dan Cornell presenting. We're still kind of filling out the format here for our virtual meetings. So feel free to add any questions to the chat or submit them via chat, and we'll look at addressing those towards the end of the presentation. But we definitely encourage any and all questions, and then feedback about the format, obviously, after the fact. If you have any experiences to share or feedback for how we deliver our future meetings and presentations while we're doing them remotely. So without further ado, I want to introduce Dan Cornell. He's going to talk to us a little bit about DevSecOps, a hot topic for the last couple of years, automating security and compliance, and some of the implications around that, and some gaps. Should be really interesting. As you guys probably already know, Dan is globally recognized. He's got 15 years of experience architecting, developing, and securing web-based software systems. So definitely a lot of experience to draw on and for us to learn from. He's a CTO at Denim Group. Take it away, Dan.
Thanks a bunch. Well, welcome everyone to the OWASP San Antonio meeting. Glad folks could make it. Hopefully everybody out there is safe and healthy. These are certainly wacky times, but we're trying to get back on a little bit better meeting schedule. I'm actually here coming at you live from Denim Group headquarters in San Antonio, Texas, where there are a whopping 4 people in the office, which is actually the busiest the office has been in quite some time, I believe. So everybody gets a couple thousand square feet of their own, all masked up and whatnot. And I'm heading out of here as soon as we finish up. But sorry that everybody couldn't be here in person. Sorry we couldn't provide pizza. If we could figure out the logistics, maybe that's a business idea, the logistics of getting distributed groups of people delivered a modest amount of pizza. If we figured that out, that'd be great. But thanks everybody for tuning in. And today I'm going to be talking about looking at different tasks in AppSec, and which are the ones that are fast that you can put into a CI/CD pipeline, and which are the ones that are not. I think there's a lot of DevSecOps fundamentalism that we see in groups that we talk to, with this like tremendous focus on pipeline, which is great. But I also think it's important to understand what is appropriate to put in a pipeline and what are the things that you realistically are not going to get in a pipeline, because you still have to do that stuff, even though it's not, really cool moto fast stuff to do. Agenda. Yeah. So we're going to talk again about all the cool kids these days. As Matt said, DevSecOps has been a really hot topic for the past couple of years, and all the cool kids are moving really fast. And so we're going to look at some examples of what people are doing. They're really exciting. Then we're going to take a step back and look at a software security assurance program, or an app security program as a whole. And we're going to look at what are the things that are realistic to address in a pipeline, or what are the things that are not realistic to do that. We're going to use the OWASP SAM as a framework for walking through that. and then sum it up with some conclusions. And as Matt said, we'll take some questions, and we're working on the format. We'll probably do questions at the end and see how well that works. So, as I said, the cool kids are all moving fast these days, right? You see the Etsy, Netflix, they're really amazing things to secure their applications and their systems in their DevOps pipelines. Fast again usually means DevOps pipeline. DevOps Day Austin a couple years ago, I think it was somebody from Etsy was talking about some of the really cool stuff that they're doing, and the question came up of that's neat, but how do you incorporate testing for things that you can't put in a scanner, your authorization testing, your business logic testing, things like that. And there wasn't a great answer for it. And so putting security into CI/CD pipelines is cool, but it's not something that you can expect to be comprehensive. And as we'll talk about, it's something where you don't want to take your focus off the overall goal of securing the applications with a myopic or really specific focus on what goes in a pipeline. And so again, like all about the pipeline, security checks, you can do application checks, infrastructure checks, cloud configuration checks, and automation is king. We were, this is an area where we talked to a lot of different organizations, and one organization we were talking to, they're really, really focused on how do we get, all this testing applied across all of our application groups, right? From, web systems, mobile systems, back to, mini computer mainframe stuff. Like, well, I don't know if that's, if it's appropriate to apply these techniques across all of these things. But if you look at the agendas of the OWASP conferences over the past couple of years, the training classes that OWASP is offering is a huge focus on pipeline, DevOps. And again, that's great. What we don't want is for people to take their eyes off the overall ball. What about stuff that doesn't fit into a pipeline? And that's a topic I'll bring up. The dangers of DevSecOps fundamentalism, to say, here's the cool new stuff that we're able to do. But a pipeline isn't a program, right? There's certain types of testing activities that is not realistic to put in a pipeline. There's many non-testing activities. There's a lot of stuff that doesn't fit in there. And so what I want to do in this discussion is to go through and talk about, here's what we've seen people be successful putting things in a pipeline. Here's what you can expect out of things that are going in pipelines, but also here's the stuff that doesn't go well into a pipeline, or where you need additional layers of coverage to get a sufficient degree of security in your program. So when I talk about SSA programs, or software security assurance programs, application security programs, whatever you want to call it in your organization, but what I'm talking about is a structured way looking at the security of how you build secure applications. And this is a little overused, I think. But the Simon Sinek TED Talk, talk about what is your why, right? Just because it's used a lot doesn't mean that doesn't still have value. And so I think it's important to take a step back and look to understand, like, what's the why of your application security program, or the why of your SSA program? Because a company that is in manufacturing or paper distribution is probably going to have a very different answer than a top 5 bank holding company, right? They've got different regulatory environments, they've got different risk environments, they're going to have vastly different budgets, different threat actors that are concerned about them, and so on and so forth. And your why needs to be your reason for starting the program. The how is going to be the activities that you undertake, and that's where we'll go through the OpenSAM, or OWASP SAM rather, as an SSA template to talk about, like, here are the various activities that you might undertake in your program. The what's are going to be the specific implementation of those activities, and CI/CD automated testing falls into this category, right? So before we start talking about testing and CI/CD pipelines, it's important to take a step back, understand your why, understand the how, and then get specific about the what's that you're going to do. And so this is, again, this talk gets bandied about quite a bit, but it's something that I have found to be valuable, because if you start with the what's, in a lot of cases, when you track back, you're going to find, hey, we're going in a direction that is not optimal for our organization. We're expending limited resources on activities or on things that are not providing us with the most value given the situation that we're in. So what's an SSA program? SSA is an acronym for Software Security Assurance, an app security program, and it's a set of practices and activities that you're going to use to reliably create, maintain, and deploy secure software in your organization. The BSIM folks call this SSI, your Software Security Initiative. AppSec program, again, we've got to have some sort of an acronym. And when I talk to organizations, I've talked to too many organizations. This is thankfully less frequently these days, but where they say, "Well, hey, we do an annual app pen test or PCI." That's not really an SSA program, or if it is your SSA program, it's probably not one that's going to be tremendously effective. When I asked that question more recently of organizations, the answer that I'm starting to get is, well, hey, here are the security checks that we figured out how to stuff in our CI/CD pipeline. That's also not an SSA program. And so again, the warning here is don't let a focus on your pipeline become your program as a whole. Shifting left isn't bad, it just isn't everything. And so the point of this webinar is not to badmouth the concept of shift left, but what we are trying to do, what I'm trying to do, is warn of situations that I've seen where an unhealthy focus on CI/CD is at the expense of other more valuable activities that are going to better reduce risk. A couple of examples of references you can use when looking at crafting an SSA program: OWASP SAM, the OWASP Software Assurance Maturity Model, and the BSIM, the Building Security in Maturity Model. OWASP SAM was originally OpenSAM from Praveer Chandra. Really great work. OWASP has since evolved or forked it from his original work. And in OWASP SAM, you've got 5 business functions. You've got 3 security practices for each and 2 streams for each. And there's a link to the SAM website. And again, this is an overview of what this looks like. We're going to use SAM as the template for stepping through, so you'll see this stuff again. The BSIM, Building Security and Maturity Model, originally from Cigital, now Synopsys, based on their data collection from participating organizations. And these, you've got 4 domains, 3 practices for each, and a total of 119 activities. And that looks like this. And so structurally, there's a lot of similarities between these two. And again, for our purposes, we're going to use the OWASP SAM. You could you have a very similar outcome if you use BSIM for the same type of a view. And one warning: if your organization is just starting out, right? If you're just distilling your why, right? You don't have an existing application security program. Using, trying to evaluate your program or assessing your program using either of those tools is less than ideal. That's something that we found because, if there's no reason to assess your program against these maturity models if you don't have a program, because you're just going to expend resources getting like, well, in this we're a 0, in this you're a 0, in this we're a 0, in this we're a 0. There's better things to do. So if you're just starting out, what we find to be a better approach is like define your scope and your mandate. Again, understanding your why. Probably start out with some testing for some applications that have a lot of visibility. Run vulnerabilities that you find through the resolution process to figure out like what we actually need to do is we find vulnerabilities and fix them. And then you can start to make decisions about how you want to proceed from there, because you'll have an understanding of the vulnerability management lifecycle in your organization. Then you can start to prioritize to say, well, we want to do this type of testing or this type of testing. We want to do this type of architecture review or whatever. But again, if you're just starting out, doing some testing on a handful of applications and getting some vulnerabilities to the resolution process is typically, we've found, a better way to start out building an app security program as opposed to measuring yourself against a yardstick like OpenSAM or BSIM. So let's talk about fast and slow, and this is a concept that Daniel Kahneman talks about in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which is fantastic. And he talks first about system 1, which is fast. This is instinctive and emotional decisions that humans make. And then looks at system 2, which is the slow, the deliberative, the logical systems. And for AppSec purposes, use configuration and customization to minimize the emotional aspects of this. One of the things that we found is in making good, like fast AppSec decisions, is taking emotion or unreliability out of that process. For stuff that you need to do fast, you need to have a high degree of reliability in those decisions. And so the question there is, how can we provide high signal, low noise information for decision makers in cases of fast? the book obviously goes far deeper into these concepts, and the analogy starts to fall apart, as all analogies do. But I found it to be a useful model, at least at a surface level, or a useful perspective for looking at AppSec programs. One aside here: what horrible names, System 1 and System 2. Like, why didn't you just call it like fast thinking and slow thinking? Why System 1 and System 2? That's almost as bad as type 1 and type 2 errors, right? Why not just call things false positives and false negatives that people can understand, instead calling things type 1 and type 2 errors? So apparently, cognitive scientists need to do a better job at like naming things, using, I don't know, simple to understand words. Another aside, there's a great book by Michael Lewis on the research and collaboration between Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Really, really incredible thinkers. So that's welcome to your second Denver Book Club selection of the day. Both really, really valuable books to read just in general, not specific to security. So now when we look, fast and slow in a culture like DevSecOps that's so focused on the fast, like what is still critical but has to go slow? All right, so what do we mean by fast? And again, for the purposes of this presentation, fast really talks about what's in a CI/CD. What are you putting into a CI/CD pipeline where you're making really rapid decisions on that? And again, we'll post these slides. There's a link to a blog post where I talk about the power and responsibility and security's role in the DevOps pipeline. Right? If you look at a DevOps, a CI/CD pipeline that the security team, that your development teams, your operations team, DevOps folks, that is a tool that they are using to build software and quickly judge, is this software acceptable or not? As security, if you get invited to participate in that pipeline, you need to be a good guest, right? You need to show your manners. And so to be DevOps fast, or DevSecOps fast from a security standpoint, you have to understand that your results have to be available quickly. Because of the speed at which these pipelines are running. They have to be high value, right? People have to care about the stuff that you're going to tell them. And you have to have low, and by low, I mean no false positives, right? Or for the real nerds out there, no type 1 errors. All right, so you've got a limited time budget, and that is not going to mesh up with the runtimes for a lot of traditional AppSec tools, right? You have to, the developers have to care about what you're going to tell them, and this cannot be emphasized enough. You can't waste the developer's time. So now let's take a walkthrough of OWASP SAM and start to look at those in the perspective of what can be fast and what can be slow. And so in the governance business function, we look at practices, strategy and metrics, policy and compliance, and education and guidance. For strategy and metrics, you can't automate strategy. If you could, that'd be fantastic. But again, your strategy goes back to your why. What's the risk environment for your organization? And so strategy is going to be slow. You can use CI/CD to feed your metrics. And so parts of metrics can actually be really fast. And that's a great thing. Metrics in general are very automatable. And so again, once you understand what you want to measure and use that to drive decision-making, you can look for ways, how can I have what is coming out of our CI/CD pipelines feeding into those metrics so we can make the best decisions possible as quickly as possible. When we look at policy and compliance, again, you can't automate the creation of your policies. I guess you could cut and paste them from somewhere. That would be faster. But you can use CI/CD pipelines to automate some policy checks, right? And so inside of a CI/CD pipeline, you can enforce certain policies to make a determination of hey, does this software, for these security requirements that we've got, or these security properties that we require, does this particular build meet that or not? All right. And so, but you also need to understand there's limitations, as we'll talk about, with the type of testing and the checks that you can put into a CI/CD pipeline, right? And so you need to be aware of those limitations and realize that the data coming from your CI/CD pipeline is a helper, but is not going to be comprehensive enough to be definitive for determining are we fully in compliance with whatever policies that we have. And so policy and compliance are kind of fast, right? Or where CI/CD pipelines can help make you faster. So when I look from a security standpoint at CI/CD policy configuration, right? You are going to, like, this goes through 3 phases, right? You're going to do some sort of testing, right? In addition to the unit tests that developers are doing, or integration tests, whatever, the automated testing that the developers have put in the pipeline to look for typically QA, quality or, quality or function bugs. You can also do security testing. And what we've found is there are certain testing activities that you can do in a synchronous way. And by synchronous, I mean you're going to run the tests inside of the pipeline, and that testing is going to finish before the pipeline finishes execution. So that, as we'll see in a minute, you can use that to make a decision. There's also testing that you can initiate in a CI/CD pipeline, but you're going to have to, that's going to be an asynchronous process. The testing process is going to run past the bounds of when that pipeline run ends. And so you're not going to be able to make a decision in the pipeline based on this asynchronous testing. But and that requires you to have a, how do you handle these out of band results to incorporate those? And that's an important thing, especially when we look at the types of app security tools that people want to put in pipelines. Some of those tools lend themselves to running in pipelines. Other tools like simply don't. So once we've done this testing, again, if we've got synchronous testing that has finished where we've got results, then we can make a decision, go or no go, based on that. And as I mentioned before, like any decision you make to break a build or to stop a pipeline, that's a pretty important decision to make, right? Especially if you're security. As I talked about, you're kind of a guest in the house of the DevOps team, especially initially when you're starting to incorporate security testing, and you need to be a good guest. If you make a lot of trouble, you're not going to be invited back, right? And so that's something where the types of decision, like, you have to be pretty sure if you're ever going to pull the chain and stop the assembly line. After that, after you've made a decision, or if you've chosen to make a decision, then you need to report what you've found, and that can potentially go to Slack or your other systems like that, or your findings may get bundled up in a bug and shipped off to Jira or something along those lines, right? But again, when we look at testing, security testing in a CI/CD pipeline, you've got testing, synchronous or asynchronous, potentially make a decision of thumbs up or thumbs down, and then your reporting phase of, like, how are you going to notify the developers of what they need to know from the run that you just did. All right, so now we look at education and guidance, right? Instructor-led training is a slow activity, right? I think there's a very strong argument to me. There is definitely a place for instructor-led training, but to take developers away from writing code for some period of time, half day, 2 days, multiple days, whatever it is, that is the slowest of slow activities, because you're not writing new code to go and run through your pipeline. Your developers are out learning something. But again, when you look at security champions programs, or situations where you're trying to get certain individuals deep knowledge in security, instructor-led training is a tremendous tool for doing that. Then we look at e-learning. Well, the big monolithic courses, not terribly fast, right? Hey, here's your OWASP top 10. We're going to go through all of them. Not terribly fast, but we have seen recently a lot more, a number of providers that have come out with these, like, real targeted vignette type of training, where you can say, hey, here's how SQL injection works in Java with Hibernate, or whatever the topic might be. And so that's something that we found organizations get a lot of benefit out of, is the ability to say, like, hey, we've detected a specific problem or a specific issue that you need to deal with. Here's some really targeted education that goes along with this, or that can very specifically educate that individual developer on what they're having challenges with. Then we look at security champions. A really common responsibility we see in organizations that are rolling out security champions programs is, like, hey, work with these dev teams and get some sort of security testing into their CI/CD environment. And so security champions is a practice. If you look at the way you're educating and providing guidance to developers, security champions are great because they can be used to make things faster. And I'll give a link to a webinar that we did specifically on that security champions topic, in depth on that. And also my colleague, John Dixon, has been talking to a bunch of organizations about their security champions programs. and compiling some of that information. If you're interested in talking to John about what he's doing with those programs, or about what he's talked about with folks about those programs, just reach out to me, or shoot me an email, or hit me on Twitter. I'm at Daniel Cornell, and I can get the two of y'all, or I can get you all linked up to talk to John about that, and and obviously see the output of that research that he's doing. Really cool stuff coming out of that. Now we look at design. We're going to look at your threat assessment, your security requirements, and your security architecture. So now if you think about it, like before, we're looking at like program-wise, what's our strategy, what's our metrics, what are our policies, what kind of compliance, how are we educating people? Now we're going into what are you doing up front when you're building software in order to hopefully end up with secure software at the end. So from a threat assessment standpoint, you need to determine your general application threat profiles. Like that is something that can't really be automated. Again, it goes back to the why. Are you a paper goods distributor, or are you a top 5 bank holding company, or a big insurance company, right? Very different threat profiles, and so that's something that is very specific to the organization. Obviously can't be automated. When you look at taking that to a specific application or specific system and doing threat modeling, that also requires a lot of manual work typically, although we have seen some really interesting new automation. Nothing in CI/CD pipelines, but there are some vendors that are doing providing some tooling support that allow you for typically manual incremental changes, but those incremental changes certainly fit better into these agile or these DevOps environments. So that's something that we've seen a number of organizations start to focus on in recent as 2020, or as they roll into 2021 initiatives, saying, okay, well, how do we scale our threat modeling practices across the organization? Again, that's typically some combination of tooling as well as developer training and whatnot. And so I'm excited to see this fit better into agile type of practices, or teams that are adopting more of a DevOps type of a culture. Security requirements, again, like determining your requirements is largely manual, although there is some tooling support available from a couple of vendors out there where they can let you, where you can say like, hey, here's the profile of the application, and they can take that and say, okay, well, here are a list of initial requirements that you may want to modify from there. And validating if these requirements are met is largely manual, but we're going to talk more specifically about that in a little bit when we talk about the verification and requirements-driven testing activity. When we look at secure architecture, again, architecture is secure architecture is not something that is able to be automated. It's largely manual. Validating this also largely manual. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But the good news is, from an architecture standpoint, once you have that established for an application, for a system, you don't see a lot of drift, right? Hopefully, you're not making architectural decisions so frequently that you would need to automate that in a CI/CD pipeline. Hopefully your architecture is well established, and again, that acts as a base for making a framework for making decisions, as opposed to something that has to be constantly reevaluated. So now we've set up and designed the software, done our architecture, done our design. Now we're going to look at the implementation, right? And we're going to look at how do we do secure the build process, how do we secure the deployment process, and how do we manage the defects, or how do we manage things that we find, and then move from there to get those actually resolved, to run those through the resolution workflow. And so secure build is really the crux of what we're discussing today. And like, this is the stuff where there's really some exciting opportunities to get stuff done fast. And one question is how can you integrate security testing into the build process? Static analysis, dynamic analysis, interactive application security testing, and also software composition analysis. And just as an aside, if you're looking, you're just getting started with software composition analysis, an excellent tool from OWASP called Dependency Check. Take a look at that. That's really, really handy. And so if you're even considering securing the build process, you have to have a repeatable build process, right? Like if you don't have a repeatable build process in your organization, like you push pause on this webinar, go get like a Jenkins for Dummies book and pick this back up later, right? Like all the stuff that we're talking about today assumes as table stakes that you already have some sort of repeatable build process. Also, another, from a maturity standpoint, an important practice here is to be able to talk about your software bill of materials, right? I just went through a build. What is all the stuff that is in that build? There's another excellent OWASP project called Dependency Track. That is another flagship level product that is all about, like, how do I keep track for all the software we're developing in our organization? How do we keep track of our bill of materials so that we know, for each of these builds, what's actually the stuff in there? Also, I've been playing around with the concept of an architectural bill of materials, especially as we move to more cloud native application development. It's not a question of like what is in this like giant monolithic application build that we just built. It's taking a step back and looking and saying, well, now we've got 20 different microservices. Each of those has like some chunk of code running on top of those, but these microservices also exist with containers and inside of a larger cloud infrastructure, ecosystem. And so, just as a as a reference to, if that is interesting, we've got a link to a webinar that we did talking about an architectural bill of materials. Again, expanding on the concept of a software bill of materials. When we look at secure deployment, this is an extension of the secure build, right? You've built software in a repeatable way. Now we need to make sure to deploy it in a repeatable way. And we tend to see organizations be a little less mature in this area. Again, because like having you're going to do a lot of builds. And so if your build is manual, like that's really painful. And so organizations fix that. You're typically doing fewer deployments than you are doing builds. Again, unless you're in one of the real cool kid organizations where every time somebody checks something in, like, that goes out to production. But this is also an area where deployments, there's a lot of value in automation of your deployment, because you can use technologies like Puppet, Chef, Terraform, and whatnot to make sure that when you deploy software, you're deploying everything in the same way, and you're enforcing or imposing the appropriate security configuration steps along the way, so that just as your build is automated, your deployment goes into an environment and you can make certain assertions about that environment. Hey, I know that these are all the pieces, these are how they're allowed to talk to one another by the cloud identity and access management. We feel good about this, right? So this is an area where you can where there are a lot of opportunities to go super fast. Next, looking at defect management, like subsets of this can be really fast, and the concern here is like you have to tune scanners or you run into problems. I've been a huge proponent of what you find with your security scanner is neat, and the security team is going to be very excited about that. If you want developers to care about it, you have to get it into the tools that they're already using. Their defect tracking, their Jira system, whatever it is, right? And so like we talk to a lot of folks about automation, like, hey, can I automate creating these defects, right? Can I go from scanner, and auto create defects? And from a technical standpoint, like that's a very possible thing to do typically, but you have to tune the scanners or you run into problems, right? As I talked about before, these results have to be high value and they have to be no false positive, because you can't be wasting development or developer time. And this, you have limited coverage with the defects that you can automatically create, because it's only going to happen for vulnerabilities that you can find with automation in the pipeline. And we're going to talk in just a minute about the testing limitations of what kind of testing can you put into a pipeline and not. From a bundling strategy standpoint, you're turning vulnerabilities into defects. Or do you want to create one vulnerability for each? Probably not, right? Typically bundling is more appropriate, because otherwise you run the risk of spending more time administering defects than fixing issues. And so if you want to bundle vulnerabilities by type, that in applications that you're just starting to get into a testing program where you're maybe finding multiple instances of a SQL injection or a cross-site scripting, or you've got some coding patterns that were less ideal where you're finding like big groups of issues, you may want to bundle by vulnerability type. For more mature applications, or applications where the testing regimen around them, you've been through a number of cycles, maybe then you just want to bundle by severity, because incrementally in the build, you're going to be finding fewer of, hopefully you're finding fewer of those vulnerabilities. I remember one organization we worked with where they went like between scans, they went from like no exposed cross-site scripting to 20 exposed cross-site scripting. It was a new developer who apparently had like the most productive first day at work, but it was good. Again, it was good, a teachable moment to say like, wow, you got a lot done, but like you need to change your coding like this. But again, in more mature applications, maybe you want to bundle by severity. Hey, we found some stuff. Here's the criticals, here's the highs, here's the mediums. And again, there may be other approaches. For the metrics and feedback stream of this, you want your scanner and your developer to provide a separation of duties, right? Scanners are going to go in there and find vulnerabilities. Developers are going to receive notes about those and make changes and fix them. And then the scanners, you want the scanners to confirm that they did. Obviously this is only applies to vulnerabilities identified by automation, but that separation of duties is important where, you're not saying, hey, developer, here's some sort of issue. The developer's like, yeah, we totally got that, right? Yeah, you want the scanner or the next pipeline run is going to come along and make a determination of, do we think the developer was successful in their effort or not? I like tracking the mean time to remediation. We look at, help an organization set up metrics programs. That's one that I look at a lot is, like defects per kiloline of code and stuff like that. Like that's tough for a variety of reasons. And especially like if you've got like old legacy applications and new stuff and whatnot, you're get readings all over the map. But that's mean time to remediation is a great metric, I think, for Agile or DevOps teams. Like, hey, we accept that we're going to, from time to time, we're going to introduce vulnerabilities, right? How quickly can we address those vulnerabilities? That's that's really the thing that is a good thing to optimize on. Now we look at verification, right? So we've built all this software. We've got the build process and the deployment process going. Now we need to go and verify, right? How successful were we in creating secure software? And we're going to look at architecture assessment, requirements-driven testing, and security testing. Architecture assessment, again, like most of this is something that you're doing manually, some sort of a threat modeling activity to confirm. But again, especially in cloud environments, that is one area where certain architectural policies you can check automatically. Cloud configuration, AWS has checks for security best practices. There's other tools like Scout Suite's an excellent tool for checking the configuration of cloud environments, and that's going to go through and run checks for things like, hey, do I have open S3 buckets? Do I have some really obvious identity and access management configuration issues, whatever that might be? A really handy tool for that. When we look at requirements-driven testing, control verification is again largely a manual process. It's not something I've not seen a lot of situations where you can get a lot of coverage for your control verification. Although there are some, like the BD security does some automated requirements testing. So for certain aspects of requirements, you can. For misuse and abuse testing, fuzzing testing can be automated, but the run times can make this challenging. If you look at the time budget, it can make it challenging to fit inside of a pipeline run. Abuse case and business logic testing, again, is manual. I've seen some attempts to use like unit testing to enforce this stuff, but it ends up being like very specific, like, hey, one time one person made this exact coding error in this place. Let's check and make sure that nobody like reverted the commit back. Again, for abuse case and business logic testing, that tends to be manual. Denial of service testing doesn't fit into most general pipelines because it tends to be slow. So for requirements-driven testing, there's some automation and integration possible, but for the requirements level stuff, like that is not an area where we see a lot of that get put into pipelines. For security testing, like this is really where the bulk of the discussion around fast and slow comes down to. And so the real question is, how sufficient is the security testing that you can stuff into a CI/CD pipeline? Now, OWASP SAM defines two different streams for this activity: your scalable baseline and your deep understanding. So for OWASP, I've been involved in OWASP for probably almost 15 years now. It's been a kind of a long time. And I think that OWASP as an organization has traditionally had a cultural focus on the strengths and weaknesses of automated tools. And that's comes from, I think, a lot of the OWASP has a very like tool vendor neutrality that I think is a good thing. Occasionally that can be a little vendor hostile. But OWASP, I think, again, has participation from a lot of consulting, a lot of consultants, which I like because I am a consultant. But I think that's important to understand when you look at testing. What can you expect from the automation or from scanners and the scanner vendors, and what are things that have to be done manual. And if you're talking to a firm that sells a scanning technology, they're going to have a certain perspective and a bias of the level of coverage you get from automation. And that, again, it's important to take into account that bias. But if you're also talking to someone who doesn't have a scanner to sell you, but has testing services, for example, to sell you, they're going to have their own perspective. And so as when this comes down to you as a security analyst trying to make these determinations, again, it's important, I think, to consult folks on the various sides of those perspectives, and you need to distill that down. But that's something I think is also very important to understand when we look at getting testing into CI/CD pipelines. I think that's great, but you have to understand what the what to expect from it. Like, what is it going to be able to do and what is it not going to be able to do? So when we look at the scalable baseline stream of the security testing activity, Sam defined 3 levels of maturity. Number 1 is we're using an automated tool at all. The second level is you're employing application-specific automation or tuning. Again, that's what we talked about, where you limit the rules so you don't see false positives, you limit runtimes and things like that. And then you can integrate that into the build process. So this discussion, presupposes that top level of maturity, all right, that you've gone through that cycle of like, hey, we've manually run an automated tool and have reviewed the output. We've tuned the tool so that it works best for this application to maximize the value of the results, minimize the false positives, and then at that point, then you're at a position where you can start to integrate this in the build process, right? And again, something that we see too frequently is like, hey, I just got a new static analysis tool, turn on all the rules, like, and blast all the code through it. You get like this giant volume of results. If that is the level of tuning that you've done, like you're not ready yet to even think about integrating that type of a tool in your build pipeline, because you're going to be, you're going to be probably running too long. You're going to be generating a lot of results that may be valuable, but are not immediately interesting to developers, and you're going to be generating a bunch of false positives as well. So if we look at the deep understanding stream, like this is all manual, doing manual testing of high-risk components or manual review of high-risk components, performing penetration testing, integrating testing into the development process. There's tooling that can help, right? Where you say, well, this is what the last build I looked at was, let's look at some diffs so that we can find new or altered functionality. And so you can help focus your manual efforts. But again, you're testing for business logic issues, for authorization type of issues. That's just something that is not possible to do with automation. So let's look specifically at testing in CI/CD pipelines. So at that top level of maturity, what can we do here? And so when we see static analysis in CI/CD pipelines, it's most organizations that we see are using the open source static analysis tools that are more like linting tools, right? They're not doing full cross method, cross class data and control flow analysis, because that takes a lot of time, right? And like from an open source tool standpoint, like building those types of analyzers is a non-trivial task, right? And there's some excellent some excellent tools out there, like Brakeman that does some of this stuff, but a lot of the ones that we've seen don't have a really strong. The open source tools again are doing more of linting type of more semantic type analysis, not this big commercial grade data and control flow analysis. Right. And so in this case, you want to go in and figure out like, hey, we want to cut down the rules because we want to make the runtime as quick as possible. And most importantly, we want to limit the false positives. Again, anything coming out of SAST in a CI/CD pipeline, we want high value results, and we want like low or no incidence rate of false positives. Otherwise, kind of the system breaks down. And so that's the thing to focus on. And again, where we've seen most organizations be the most successful is with those freely available language-specific linting type tools. Dynamic analysis, there's challenges there with concerns about runtime. If you've got a big application, right, to run and fuzz that whole application is going to take time. we've done some work in running targeted DAST to say, let's find the changes in the app and only run tests on these like new pages or pages that have changed. There's a link to the webinar where we've talked about doing that presentation I've given at a bunch of OWASP events. But that's the challenge we see with DAST is if it's not targeted as your application gets to be of a decent size, it's just not like time budget-wise realistic to incorporate into a pipeline. If we look at IAST and CI/CD, that's fantastic. An important thing to understand is that typically IAST is going to require you to generate traffic in the application, right? So the testing sensors can go off. You could use DAST to generate that traffic, but as we've identified, that's kind of a potentially runtime wise not going to be acceptable. You can also do things, and there's some great blog posts out there that talk about like, hey, here's how we can use our integration tests and feed those through a proxy and use that to generate the type of traffic that the IaaS tool is going to need to get their level of coverage that they need. Also looking at software composition analysis in CI/CD, like that's fantastic. And the only question that I've got there is look at the runtime trade-offs versus the velocity of new components and new vulnerabilities. Like how frequently are you bringing new open source libraries into your application? How frequently are you identifying, is the world identifying new vulnerabilities and components? Like yes, those things are happening at some rate of speed. Is that happening fast enough that you need software composition analysis in your CI/CD pipeline? But again, if you can get that tuned so that you're not seeing a lot of false positives, you got high quality results, that can be a great sensor you can have in your in your pipeline. So moving on, now we're looking at operations, and so we've like set up the framework. We thought about building software and how we were going to do it. We built some software. We tested the software. Now the software is out in the world, and and again, time is going to pass. How are we going to handle things that occur? So we look at incident management, environmental management, and operational management. For incident management, like that's not in a pipeline, right? Like hopefully you've got some automation in place to do detection where possible. If you've got like a web app firewall or a RASP or something like that, you can use that to detect, hey, is there malicious activity being targeted at the application? Is there some sort of a breach or something that we need to worry about? There's certainly some automation frameworks for incident response that are out there. Those are a little outside of the scope of the incident management is its own whole discipline. But again, this is not something that's going to happen in a pipeline. It's something you're going to do when you detect something. And of course, if you talk to your favorite WAF or RASP vendor, they'll tell you that they'll just sort the whole thing out for you. Just protect it, and you don't need to worry about it anymore. One other reference that I'll provide for you. My colleague John Dixon did a presentation a while back looking at like how do we capture security intelligence for applications, because a lot of times the things that developers think to log are the things that help them debug like the behavior of an application for a specific workflow, right? Or a specific expected result. Is this doing what it's supposed to do? From a security standpoint, security folks are less interested in individual activities, right, or debugging the application. They're looking more broadly over time to say, is there a pattern of usage of this application that indicates something that I should be concerned about? And so again, in this presentation that John gave, he comes not from a development background like me. He comes from a more traditional, information security, pen testing and controls and things like that background. And so he talks about like, hey, here's some things that developers often don't think about when they're doing their logging, when they could be doing some logging that would also help potential incident responders with their activities later on. Environment management. I can't remember where I first heard this, and I absolutely can't take credit for it. But this concept of your servers should be cattle, not pets. I remember at my first company, we named all of our servers after like biological agents, and so we had anthrax and Mataba and whatnot. I guess these days we would probably have a server named COVID. But our servers were certainly pets. They weren't cattle. These days you want your servers to be cattle, not pets, right? Where they're, where you can bring them up and down and whatnot. And again, when we talked about this configuration handling, hopefully when we did the secure deployment, work, you're using tools like Chef, Puppet, Terraform to configure stuff in a repeatable way that has the security properties that you want. And then you can use tools like Scout Suite to determine, hey, I just stuffed a bunch of new things into this cloud environment. Is that cloud environment set up using the best practices that I wanted? And for your patching and updating stream, again, the detection of patches that you don't have, that is the type of thing that is very easy to automate in a lot of cases. Actual patching tends to be slow because you need to know, is this patch going to impact the behavior of the server and my application in a way that's not acceptable, right? You got to make sure that you don't break anything. And that is why like actual patching is as much as I would love for it to be automated, we haven't seen a lot of success with that in organizations. Operational management, we look at the data protection stream. That's, again, not something that your CI/CD pipeline has anything to do. Again, your DLP solution will sort all of that out. And the tail end of operational management, decommissioning systems, decommissioning servers, that is also typically something that we see is a very slow activity because you don't want to take something down that is supposed to be running, right? If you think the CIA triad, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, a lot of people tend to over-focus on confidentiality, maybe understand integrity, and not think about availability until you accidentally decommission something that was supposed to be up and running, and then you certainly hear about it. I've been in scary meetings where people talk about like, oh no, that application's turned off. Like, no, it's not. We've got this customer, your contract with the customer where it's got to be up and running, and we've got a copy of that for that other bank also running over here as well. Scary meetings where people realize like, oh, we've got all this attack surface that we didn't know about. So the decommissioning process, again, I would love a world where organizations were better at automating decommissioning. The risk there is taking down something that is valuable, important, contractually required, whatever that might be. So let's just look at some conclusions. Right, what goes in a pipeline? Linting type SAST, DAST if you can target it. IAST if you can generate meaningful traffic, software composition analysis if you want, right? Like these are the things we found people to be very successful doing that, and that is fantastic. Again, knowing about vulnerabilities earlier rather than later is a good thing. Getting security better integrated so that they're weighing in on builds is a good thing, especially if you're doing it well. And these are the things again where we found organizations have a lot of success with. A great area to focus on. What likely has to be done outside, your full commercial grade SAST, full DAST, right? Like just the run times for a lot of those tools make them not great, not attractive targets for synchronous, being involved in a synchronous, testing pipeline. Maybe you kick them off with a build activity, but then you have to like capture the results and clean those up later. So again, it's the time that it takes to run, but it's also, okay, well, hey, now we've got results that are important, but maybe it's not immediately obvious to developers why it's important to them. Right. So therefore, okay, well, hey, these vulnerabilities, we need to provide some context and work with the development team on when they're going to get fixed. Right. Because these reflect not like, hey, you've got a gross SQL injection or cross-site scripting hanging off your unauthenticated login page, but these are vulnerabilities that are serious, but that maybe are not so serious that you like break the build to fix them right away. You can live with the risk for a while. And again, these are also the types of results where you've got to curate those to make sure that you're not pushing false positives back to developers. Best and most efficient way to get kicked out of the build pipeline. Again, manual code review, penetration, threat modeling, these are also activities that largely have to happen outside of the pipeline. What absolutely has to be done outside of the pipeline, it's most everything else. Again, your strategy, your policy, your training, your architecture, and your security requirements, those are all manual activities specific typically to an organization. The good news is, though, you hopefully don't see a lot of drift on those. Like once you have those, you can kind of set that and forget it, and that provides a framework in which everyone is operating, and you're not thrashing on those things. And so, these are slow, which again, no one likes because they want to be the cool kids, DevSecOps shop. But again, once you have these things, those are durable. Their value is durable over time. So shifting left is awesome. I think it's fantastic. I've like watched presentations at the DevOps days and at OWASP conferences and people doing this really amazingly cool stuff. And again, having been in the industry for 15 years, we've come a long way from like, what is your program? Oh, we do an annual pen test of like these two applications because we have a contractual requirement to do it. We've come a long way from, annual test because we have to, and only for the stuff that we have to, to now where we're looking and saying, hey, every time we have a new build go through, we're checking the components to make sure there's no known vulnerabilities. We're doing like linting SaaS. Like there's a huge gap between those, and that is fantastic. I think it is. I think it's awesome, but it's only one aspect of a more complicated landscape, right? And so for testing, you need to think of coverage, right? For your classes of vulnerabilities, your different detection approaches, like what level of coverage can you get from the automated tools, and what are the other activities or tooling that you need to layer on that in an asynchronous manner in order to get the level of coverage that you require. And for everything else, again, think programmatically. CI/CD pipelines are a very specific what and a much larger question about why and how that you're doing. And so programmatic thinking, again, is the appropriate place to start before you zero in on specific tactics. Good. Let's see. All right. So now just take some time for questions. If anybody has any questions, I don't know if folks want to do that via the chat. Peter Olschlager, yes, Saren. I remember, yes, the good old days at Rare Medium where we had I guess Saren's not really a biological agent, so our naming convention wasn't great. But yeah, Peter remembers, yeah, that our file server was named Saren. Very good. Yeah, and I think can we go ahead and open it so people can unmute themselves? Is the recording going to be available? Let's see. Carrie, yes. Good. Excellent.
So while we wait for questions, Dan, thanks very much for reviewing this. Was a lot of information, but I think you covered like some really important points here. I've been at companies where folks at the C level or VP level are like, we need to shift left. We need to get all the testing into the pipeline, and we need to be breaking builds. Like we don't want any bad code, going out to production. We've got to do this, we've got to do that. And it's like, yeah, we do want that, but like we've got to start at the beginning. And I think it's interesting to think about kind of the different phases. Like I like your guidelines and guardrails around like what are the how do we phase, or which tools are appropriate, which validations are appropriate. But I think there's even some degrees to phasing things in for that. So I like the idea of putting SAST into the build process, not necessarily as a gate, but just to make sure that it gets done. And yeah, somebody's going to have to go review the results, weed out the false positives and validate things. But at least we know it's getting done because it's getting done by automation. You can't necessarily make a decision based on that, but somebody isn't going to have to go run the scan manually or whatever. And obviously there's might not be the best example because you can integrate with IDEs and other things like that. There's a bunch of different approaches there as well. But the idea of how do we transition from doing nothing in the pipeline to doing, being able to gate and break builds and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great point. And like a lot of things sound like great ideas. They sound like truthy, but then when you look at the operationalization of them, you realize like maybe this doesn't work as well as we thought. I think, not independent of CI/CD pipelines. I think that's something that we saw with the static analysis vendors, where the initial evaluation criteria was like which one finds the mostest stuff, right? And that is certainly one way that you can rank your static analysis tools that you're evaluating. But there's the flip side of that, which is like are these false positives? Do I care about these results? Like, what am I going to do with that? So it's that full life cycle of like detecting, evaluating, fixing, and verifying. And certain criteria of does this find the most stuff might not lead to the most effective life cycle, once you've operationalized that technology. So one question here about what do you see as the top 5 CI/CD myths, and by contrast with the realities. I don't know if I can give you 5, although now I feel like Carrie in marketing has assigned me a blog post to write called the top 5 CI/CD myths. So thanks, Carrie. But again, I think the challenge, just to go back to kind of some of the themes I talked about, was like that your existing tools are going to run well in a pipeline without significant work on them. I think that's I think that's a myth. I think that breaking the build is a universal good thing for security to be able to do. I would maybe disagree with that. And I think also going back to like fully automating the life cycle of like the defect creation and whatnot, is great if you can do it, but is also dangerous. And so, I think it's kind of those types of thoughts of like, hey, we're just going to take what we're already doing and stuff that in a pipeline, and that's going to like totally work without any trouble. Those are kind of the myths that we see. And I guess now I've got to think up 2 more, and I'll keep an eye on the blog, and we'll get something up on that. Let's see. From Sam here, techniques recommended for scoring or ranking the results of testing. Yeah, and so how do you rank results? And the kind of first piece of information that you have is really the context of the application, right? So for this application, what are its characteristics, right? Is it public facing? Is it partner facing? Is it internal facing, right? Because that's going to determine the level of risk associated with it. What is the application managing? Is it managing like who's going to bring the potato salad to the company picnic? Or is it managing like really sensitive like banking data and transaction data or health data or something like that, right? And so when at the starting point, for this application, these are its characteristics. That's going to determine what is acceptable to have in the application and not. The next line then is when you run a scan or you do a test, right? You're going to get some sort of a prioritization coming out of that. That's going to typically the tools like have some methodology around that where it's the impact versus like likelihood of exploit or ease of exploit or whatever that is. And so that's going to kick out a critical, high, medium, or low. Those are again a valuable starting point, but then also you potentially have to layer on some human knowledge about that to say, well, is this in an unauthenticated part of the application or is it an authenticated part of the application, right? I'm more scared about something that is unauthenticated that anybody can get to. I'm less scared about something in an admin page where the population of folks that are using that are 5 trusted individuals, right? And so really, like I personally like Dread. Everyone else, including everyone at Denner Group, hates Dread, and that's fine. They're probably smarter than me, and so we've moved away from that in most of our stuff. But and you could also look at other similar techniques or whatever where you're incorporating not just like here's the raw result that the tool has, but here's also like some context applied to that that is going to bump that up or down. Let's see, talk about the cyber skills gap. Okay, so Jeremy Polanski, cyber skills gap, the security test in the pipeline can't solve everything. Organizations are short on security folks. It's still worth it to build up CI/CD security tests early, or is it too much trouble until the organization is more mature and the security team can handle managing the pipeline test? So that's a great question. And so I guess my answer to that is that's going to depend on your ability to get those results that come quickly, that are important to developers, and that are that are high value, or not false positive, high confidence, right? And so if you can incorporate some low level stuff that says like, hey, we're doing this linting analysis and we're finding like we feel like we can run this tool easily with people that maybe don't have really strong security skills, like here's a couple of configuration checks that we're going to run, and that we always want to make sure that we don't mess it up, then yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's a great thing to do. If you look at, like, as you make that more elaborate, then you require greater security knowledge and tuning knowledge and specific knowledge of the tools. And so in a case like that, again, what you don't want to do is put something in your CI/CD pipeline that is just creates more trouble and chaff that the development team is going to have to deal with. And so I think that's a great that's a great question. And again, the answer is, if you can do high impact stuff that's not causing trouble, that's fantastic. If you can't do that, then you probably need to wait for the professionals to come in and do that.
So Dan, what do you think about the idea of kicking off kind of a parallel job that doesn't affect the actual build process? Again, maybe it's static analysis or something that'll just go run. The rest of the build finishes, but then you can check that report afterwards.
Yeah, I think that's great. As long as that report is going somewhere, right? Yeah. It's kind of like I remember when I was a kid and wanted a puppy, and I swore I'd like feed it and pick up the poop and whatnot. Like everybody, like, oh, I gotta have this WAF, I've gotta have this IDS, I need to be doing all this testing. Well, that's cool. There's somebody like picking up the poop that the WAF is like throwing out, picking up the poop that your scanner is finding. And so again, it's great to kick off that process. But if that like goes into like the 1984, like the memory hole or whatever, where you like folded up your document and just like and like vanished, it's got to mean something, right? If you're not doing something with the results, then like why are you even bothering to do the upfront stuff? But,
yeah, for sure. And I think the other side of that, to answer this question, or another kind of perspective, is one of the things we did at Rackspace fairly well with a couple of teams when I was working there, was partnering with the QA folks. So a lot of times QA has test script or test framework or whatnot, and so we actually added security test cases to that framework. We didn't have to build the framework. We just learned how it worked, and then we added code to the repo. And we just started off with basic checks like, input validation or whatever with, FuzzDB or something like that they don't typically do. Or even just suggesting to them that they do approaches like that. Like, what are some basic test cases they can add to their frameworks or their unit tests or whatever to increase the coverage there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, and something that I think we're also seeing. I love that talk about involving QA, because I really think that over the next couple of years, security tools are going to start looking and feeling a lot more like development tools. So again, like it's going to be more on the QA teams and on the development teams, and rely less on experts or whatever, to start to incorporate some of the security checking. Let's see, consensus and time limit based on work with client, time for pipeline to complete. DevOps managers, 30 minutes is not cumbersome, but developers might disagree. How fast is fast? And so that's a good question. And like an interesting, the data point that stands out the most to me is from talking to a couple of security folks doing, like in their organizations, doing a lot of incorporation of testing into CI/CD pipelines is the time budgets. Like the most common time budget that security got, at least in a pipeline, was like 8 to 12 minutes, right? And that kind of varied, but those were like, if we like threw darts, like that's where the data points kind of landed of like, hey, security people, right? I'll give you 8 to 12 minutes, and you got to do whatever you're going to do in that time, because we've got to keep it moving on down the line. And so, especially if we're looking at like individual builds, 30 minutes, or like, I don't think 30 minutes is unreasonable depending on the velocity that your team is moving. And I think of like watching merge requests come in our environment, and that's pretty reasonable, because we're not looking to push stuff to production like 100 times per day or something like that. Again, so it's going to depend on your particular software project. Is this something that is like going out into production, you're trying to do multiple pushes per day, or is this a product where you're doing delivery where you've got to push every sprint every 2 weeks or something like that? That's going to make a determination of like how responsive that pipeline has to be. Let's see. Have I read Liar's Poker and any other books about decision understanding that have interested me, similar to Thinking Fast and Slow? Yeah, I read Liar's Poker. That's fantastic. That was great. And Michael Lewis was on a podcast I listened to recently. It might have been like the Tim Ferriss show or something like that. But yeah, really interesting guy. I've read a bunch of his stuff and really enjoyed it. Yeah, that's for book club, an additional book club selection. Liar's Poker, fantastic. Another book that I found really valuable, and I believe it's called How to Measure Anything. And that and kind of the premise of the book is like when you measure something, like you don't have to be exactly right. You have to be directionally correct and know the range of how wrong you might be, right? And so if you ask me like how much does a 737 plane weigh, like I don't know, right? And if Wikipedia was down and I couldn't go look that up, I'd think like, oh, okay, well, hey, it's I don't know how long a 737 is, but it's probably between this long and this long, and it's probably this big around, and it's made of steel, and that's aluminum and whatnot, and those materials are about whatever. And so I do some math stuff and come up with like, hey, it's probably between. I'm pretty confident that I'm 90% confident it's between these two numbers, right? And that's something I think has been really valuable for me in looking at security stuff, because again, I see a lot of people argue on Twitter of like, oh, well, this has to be risk-based and numerical and quantitative and whatnot, and like, oh, I need everything to roll up into a dashboard that has like exact numbers out to the decimal place. That was like an Atlassian feature. Now your story points can have decimal places. Like, oh, really? Like, are your developers that good at estimating? Sure, man. But like, so that How to Measure Anything was really useful in looking at like, okay, hey, when I'm presented with a situation where I've got to provide a response in the face of a limited information or a lack of knowledge, like here are some approaches you can use to be able to say, like, not that the answer is 10, but like I'm pretty sure the answer is between like 7 and 14. So that's a great book. Let's see. Have you read Liar's Poker? Talking about lack of resources, nearshoring. I don't have a lot of experience with organizations nearshoring outsourced app testing, Juan. But it's good to see you, man. Good to hear from you. How do you get and keep business decision makers involved with the CI/CD security priority testing? And so, I haven't had a lot of success getting decision makers involved with like CI/CD testing, right? Again, because from business standpoint, like that's a real like specific thing that you're doing, and it's more. I think it's more important to be able to communicate. Like, here is the level of coverage that here are the resources we've invested. Here's the level of coverage that we have. Right, so we've inspected things to this depth, and if you want more, if you want more assurance, we're going to need more resources, be that time or money or investment of people's efforts or whatever that is. Like from a business decision maker standpoint, I think you need to be talking more about like the why and the how, not the what. Because if you're in a conversation with, if you're in a conversation with a business decision maker about like how you're tuning the static analysis tool, that's probably not a super high value conversation for that person, or they're viewing it as a novelty. Maybe they're interested in it. But I think that the important thing, like when we see, and I've got a paper I wrote about this, or this like this kind of so-called digital transformation, is businesses saying we need to like be able to innovate and move faster, right? At the business level, right? At the CEO level, they're saying, I don't want to be the last CEO of Kodak that didn't quite, that didn't get digital photography, right? I don't want to be that. I don't want to be in that Harvard Business School case study, right? So we've got to take our organization digital, right? That then comes down to, well, hey, move faster. How do we do that? Well, you adopt a DevOps culture. Okay, what does that DevOps culture mean? Well, that means we're going to adopt like tools like CI/CD pipelines and building blocks like cloud servers and things like that. And then like security is on the tail end of that. And so like with the business decision makers, I don't know that it's valuable to talk about like, hey, we've got everything running in the CI/CD pipeline. I think it's important to be able to say, hey, we're doing all these testing activities, and here's the type of information about risk that we're getting that we can then provide to you so that you can make good business decisions about like what direction we want to go. Let's see. And good. There's also a how to measure anything in cybersecurity. Fantastic. I'm glad to see that book is out there. I'll have to pick that up and read it because again, how to measure anything was really fantastic. Well, good. Any other questions? I've missed seeing you is probably the wrong. I have missed seeing all of the OWASP San Antonio folks, and I'm happy to see that we have some San Antonio people that have attended. It's great to see folks, or virtually see them. Well, good. If there's not any other questions, thank you all very much for coming out today. Really appreciate this. As Carrie said, we'll have the recording here, as soon as we can like get that pulled off the server and whatnot. Really appreciate everybody spending time here. Hope everybody stays safe and healthy. These are wacky times, and we're, I think, all fortunate that we're if you're on this webinar, you're presumably in an industry in the security industry that lends itself to virtual work and whatnot, and so hopefully you have not been as negatively impacted as you possibly could have been. But everybody stay safe and healthy out there, and hopefully we'll see you again in about a month.
Yep. Thanks, Dan.
Awesome.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, guys.